Today, in the latest episode of our podcast series, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Mr. Tim Davis. Tim, you and I obviously get to work together on an almost daily basis now, which I can only apologize for. But for our audience out there who may or may not be so familiar with you, would you mind doing your own little introduction, perhaps explaining where you've been, what you've been doing, and what the next few months will hold for you?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, Richard, and thanks for the invite. I've been really excited to be on this podcast, actually. So, yes, hi, everyone. I'm Tim Davis. I started in this industry probably very similar, actually, to Richard. I suppose that we both started quite a long time ago. We won't talk about that. Graduated in a life science degree. Didn't want to work in a laboratory. Didn't know quite what to do, so sort of fell into clinical data management, as there was an advertisement in the back of the New Scientist journal, which was still in paper, and we'll probably get onto paper later on, I guess. But yeah, ended up working for ParExcel, and that was really given 3 tools when I started on day one, which was a red pen, a green pen, and a pad of sticky notes. And it didn't really change, actually, in the 2.5 years that I was there. So I decided to try something else. So I ended up moving across and moving more into the tech side of things. And that's when I started getting more involved with EDC. Was really fortunate to work for Procter & Gamble Pharmaceuticals. They did quite a lot of innovation there. So we did some interesting stuff in osteoarthritis, including patient diaries, and very rudimentary sort of touchscreen. I guess they would be like netbooks. But this was sort of early 2000s, so the term netbook didn't really exist, but we were collecting pain scales in osteoarthritis using these sort of quite simplistic tools, and did that for a few years, and that really got me excited about the patient experience. And from there, worked through several ePro, eCOA businesses, including starting my own and running that for 12 years. Which has led me to here and working with you, Richard. So now I look after strategy for my Veeva, which is all of the patient-facing technologies.
Very good. I didn't realize our history was quite so entwined. I think I read the same job advert. I ended up at Glaxo, as was at that point. But I fell in love initially with the green, the red, and the blue, and the black strategy, I think, whereas he perhaps departed the other way. But we are better for that, which is good. So maybe we can start then. From those early experiences, how would you, for our audience, how would you describe what you think? I suppose I'm going to say good data management is, but I don't mean data management as a function. I mean data as a concept. How do you think we should be going about managing data from all of the different sources, and what did those early experiences perhaps teach you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I mean, I think from an eCOA, ePro perspective, when we were sort of working in the early 2000s, it was really around sort of, it was selling, but it was almost evangelizing it. It was the concept of, can you get patients off paper? And can you get them onto an electronic device? Will they be okay with that? And more importantly, will the regulators be comfortable with this transition? What about the hundreds of studies we've run before using paper-based patient surveys? So that was a big challenge at the front end. But then to answer your question about data management, when we did do our sort of early ePro studies on those wonderful Palm pilots, data management was really an afterthought. Because it's one of those unusual things where often ePro isn't really it's not under the purview, I suppose, of clinical data management. It's not really something that's looked at because it's source data. It's not something you can query. It's not your typical EDC source. So it's just another, I remember a data manager saying, it's just another source of pain. It's just another lab load I have to deal with. So it was the thought was always after the fact, I think, around that experience. So we were always chasing those sort of scenarios when it came to an early data look or a database lock or a freeze where it's like, oh, yeah, there's all that ePro data, isn't there, floating around? So that was always a learning, I think, is we really need to think about, can we move it further up the agenda, and how do we bring the sort of the data management and the overall trial team together.
And thank you for saying it that way. You've kind of triggered three things in my mind, and maybe we can cover each. But you remind me, my first experience of, let's call it quality of life.
Yeah.
We would now firmly put into the ECOA brand. It was like pain scales. And I remember on paper CRFs having to validate that the line was exactly 10 centimeters.
Yeah.
I then remember having to buy validated rulers. I then remember having to buy invest in a very precise set of processes to whether there was a straight line drawn on the page or a slightly angled line, or what if a cross? And what if the cross wasn't actually on the line, was just above or below? About the energy we expended into the processes, it's quite extreme. But I also think it built up something which I wanted to come back to on. You mentioned about how we kind of treated quality of life and ECOA data differently. I always think it was born out of those paper processes. During those paper processes, I'm not sure we truly explored the value of that data. And then when you came to loading it, it was an afterthought. They said, "I will just merge it on." No one actually looked at how does this data interrelate? And is that something you think you would agree with or disagree with, or is that something you think persists today as well?
No, I'd agree with you. In fact, that was one of our sort of positioning points when we were sort of trying to launch, I guess, a vanguard of EPRA and say that you can do this. You will be more aware of the patient experience, good, better, indifferent, because you'll at least see this information coming through. You're absolutely right on the visual analog scales. I did the same thing. In fact, funny story for me, where I didn't have to go and buy special rulers, but we were running a study and it was on paper, and they'd run out of CRF pages, which, as you know, as a data manager, did happen from time to time. And it was a great idea. The monitor said, "It doesn't matter, I've just photocopied some more." And it was like, oh my God. Because obviously when we measured it, it was 9.7 centimeters long rather than 10 centimeters long. And people will be listening to this podcast, I hope, and going, what are they talking about? How could this possibly have an impact? But when this is a primary endpoint for subjective measurement of progressive pain in osteoarthritis, for example, or rheumatoid arthritis, it's how we decide whether, or not how the FDA decides whether this drug is better and more suitable for patients in the market space. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the paper was really, we're just going to collect it, it'll come in, it'll be the good, the bad, the ugly, we'll load it in, and then it'll get submitted. Whereas with the electronic data, it's like, well, we can see it in real time, which I think is fantastic, and monitors could see it, investigators could see a calculation and go, okay, since your last visit, it looks like it's been a bit easier for you to get up and down the stairs or to get out of bed in the morning. Those, really simple things. But the challenge then was, we get to the study and go, okay, well, the site has seen the data, we've seen a blinded version, but the data managers can't put this together as part of the overall asset, the data that then goes to the regulators. That was that was the missing step, I guess. We had it at the front, we had real-time data, but we didn't have it in the right place for that data management process to exist.
Yeah, I suppose, for the audience who are hopefully far younger than us to know
yes.
the time from data being recorded to the time data management actually got the page was usually 8, 10, 12 weeks on average.
Yeah.
The time you've entered it and processed it and actually put it into a format where it's going to be consumed, it's 12 to 14 weeks. And I think that's a 3-month gap between events and actually someone being able to visualize it.
Yeah.
Visualize it, I guess that's also the time where someone was starting to say, how does that quality of life measure stack up to adverse events or to medications or to other parts of the data? Well, 3 months is a very long time for that to be available to all and consumable. So I guess that's maybe the number one challenge you're facing today as you think about redesigning some of those processes. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think it would actually. I mean, I think, that was one of the reasons why I was, so keen to join Veeva. It was that, I've ran businesses, I've worked for businesses where we've created a a good front end, I would say, from an ePro eco perspective. We tried to make it as easy as possible for sites, and a nice, intuitive, functional app for the patients as well. But it was always, we were an island, I suppose, as well, and there are lots of islands in a clinical trial of technology vendors and choice. I'm sure we'll get onto that as well. Whereas I always thought if we were part of a broader system, then that would make it a lot easier for bringing together and, as you say, really reducing those timelines. And so, yeah, I always thought this would be a good thing to do if we could get there. And that's really, that's my challenge, is to help Veeva, help the industry get us there.
But I just want to come back to one other thing you said about regulators.
Yes.
How closely do you think, or how do you think regulators both support and maybe hinder some of the conversations you're in today? How has their position either moved or stayed stationary in these conversations?
Yeah, I may be a lone voice here, but I think the regulators actually do a pretty good job. And it certainly got better in the sort of time that I've been working in the sort of patient space. I would say, it was a surprise to them. I would say it was a surprise to the pharmaceutical industry, and I remember having these conversations that patients were normal people. And they did actually have a life outside this clinical trial, and the chances are they probably do have a mobile phone, or now a smartphone as we would know it. Because I would have these conversations with clinical trial teams and go, I can't see that they would want to do that, or they'd want to do it on their own device, or any of those kind of things. Oh, that's just not going to work. And I'd say, well, did your gran have one? Oh yeah, we bought her one about 3 years ago. It's a great way of staying in touch. Well, that patient is somebody's gran, or a relative, or something like that. So there was an evolution in mobile technology happening throughout the 2000s, and really that's what drove an adoption and a groundswell of an opinion. And it took there was just a lag from industry and from regulators. That what do we do about this? But I'd say they've caught up, and they are supportive of, yes, you can use a patient's own device as long as you meet the regulations, which is really the regulations have never changed from that perspective. It's got to have an audit trail. It's got to be secure. You've got to be able to point to, that the actual person did complete it. All those things that, by the way, you can't do on paper. So quite why this is seen as this sort of paradigm of integrity, I've never quite grasped. But they're there. But the challenge of the industry, I'm sure you found it in the early days of EDC and the other things that you've worked in, is no one quite wants to sort of go all in or be first from that perspective and say, well, it says it's okay, so we think it is okay, so let's do it. And then obviously there's internal regulators within industry, there's CRO regulators, all those things have gone, well, maybe next time. And so there's this pent-up desire, and it just doesn't always come across. Some companies have moved and they've gone with it, and they've gone and they've really pushed, which is amazing to see. But there's a hesitancy, and I think the hesitancy is the regs, but also the legacy of ePro, and we'll probably talk more about that. There's lots of things we did because we had no other way of delivering it, frankly, that sort of have created barriers to adoption and innovation in the future as well. So we do have some sort of hurdles that we need to overcome as well. But from a regulator perspective, I would say, I think it's in a good position. It's now we all just need to be brave as an industry to move forward.
I want to just switch direction a little bit here and talk about, you mentioned patient centricity, site centricity, and I'm going to use the word only once in this entire podcast, that's decentralized. I wish that word was struck from our vocabulary, never to be used again.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because in the context of what we just discussed, I worry that word is holding us back. I worry that word is where everyone says we have to be, but without a clear path to get there, and by the way, I don't even think that is the right path, but without a clear path, we're not taking those little stepping stones. What do you think about that, and what's your feelings on everything from site and patient centricity through to that word I refuse to use?
Yes, I've enjoyed a lot of our conversations about that over the past year or so, and I would agree. But I suppose on the site and patient centricity side, yes, I have a similar sort of allergic reaction to it as well, because I think they're overused terms and they're dangerously close to becoming meaningless, I think. For me, on the patient side of things, I've always thought that patient centricity is just summarized by one word. It's choice. It's giving some options to a patient. I've always, I remember seeing presentations saying our aim is to delight the patient or give the best patient experience. They're unlikely to be delighted to be in a clinical trial because they are ill and they are struggling with a disease and trying to work through that. And they've volunteered their time as this has seemed like an option for them for various reasons. But I don't think we can delight. I think we can make it as convenient and as comfortable as we can. And we do that by saying, look, here is not a hard prescriptive process. There are certain things we have to do, I'm afraid, but we don't need to do everything. So, can some of those visits, and I'll use it now, be decentralized? Could they do it from home, for example? Are they, obviously for rare diseases, they might be traveling a very long way to get to their clinical hospital as the specialized technology. Could some of the more routine stuff be done at a local pharmacy, for example? That would be a nice thing. In terms of information, my big thing is around education, information. I think we assume, because we spend our lives in clinical trials and looking at protocols, that everybody else immediately knows what all of these acronyms and things are, whereas they're still probably processing the fact that they're in a clinical trial and they're very ill. So I think that, is there an easy way that they can look at frequently asked questions? Is there an easy, digestible understanding of what the disease is? Why the trial is designed the way it is? Why do you have to keep doing these blood tests? I hate these blood tests. All of those kind of things I think will be valuable, and let's not give them it in one big lump. Let's, I think, let's give it when they need it. We know when a patient is going to struggle. One thing we're really good at is data in the clinical operation space. We know that, well, at this point, typically we see patients leaving the study. We're lost to follow up because, frankly, they've had enough. They're tired, they're in pain. So we need to do something here. Well, what can we do? What's our intervention at those kind of things? So I would say that's the centricity side of things. I think on the site side of things, which is in some ways is harder, actually, especially when you're trying to do all three. You want fast data, which is your world, for the sponsor CRO. We want a great patient experience, and we want something that the sites can manage. That's three balls juggling, almost, they're flaming chainsaws that you're trying to juggle there, because someone somewhere is always going to have to compromise. Someone somewhere is going to sort of lose out. Because if you're a sponsor, you want a very patient-centric kind of solution, you might go in with the best of intentions. And then you might think, well, what are my ethics boards going to say about this? What will my regulatory team say about all of these kind of things? Maybe I should just pull back a little bit. Maybe I'll do it next time, as we already said. So there's that. And so it's not a great experience for the patient. And maybe even the patient, I would argue, hates the trial, because although there is some flexibility, they don't know what app is in what thing and what they need to do today. So for site centricity, I think it's a similar word. It probably isn't quite choice, because we know that they are our window to clinical trials, our window to patients. But it is, I think it's about, as much as we can, giving some convenience to them. So, the solutions we provide, they do need to be as much as possible under one roof. And by that, I mean under one username and password, and should be intuitive. And if we can give something back, wonderful. But yeah, I think it's those that way. But I put the bar lower. I don't aim and aspire to delight. I would love to, but this is medical research. And so therefore there are certain things we have to do. And it's really about just ensuring we do it in the best way, the most humane way, the most approachable and easy to understand way possible.
But can I perhaps shift you to that and think about digital trials of the future?
Yeah.
How are you thinking about what's to come? Because, obviously you and I are looking at solutions we're developing, but I know from our conversations, we're already aware we're really moving into a realm where borders will get broken down very quickly. There's crossover. There's a need for products to absolutely work as one. And as you use your scenario with patients perhaps doing different things in different places, that data needs to move and be freely available to all. So how do you think about digital trials and what's to come?
We've been doing bits of digital trials forever, and one of the reasons we don't like the DCT term is that it often means you're giving a patient a device and they're going home and recording their migraines as they happen. Okay, so that's something that's been happening since the late 90s, actually. It may have been on a very different device then, but fundamentally, that's what you're doing. That's just a patient diary. But I think it all came to a head, didn't it, in COVID, actually, and where the operating model just got turned upside down, sites got shuttered, and so we all tried to manage to the best of our abilities. And while I suppose a lot of sponsors were cherry picking technologies and saying, oh, well, actually for this one, I think it'd be really good if we did e-consent, or this one, we always do ePro, so we'll definitely do ePro for that one. All of a sudden, every study had everything just pushed onto it. So we just layered a tech. And again, they knew their vendors, they knew they were good, to your point, really good at getting those data. So we just piled it on. And then sites were under stress anyway, because the other side of the wall, they were managing a pandemic, basically. And so we found that disparate systems, we had patients downloading different apps, struggling at home, not being able to see their nurse, their typical point of contact for their sites being overwhelmed as well. So really we say, well, there's some value here, we think, but the traditional way of selecting vendors wouldn't necessarily work as a scalable, repeatable model for digital trials that we're looking for. So I think for me, it's got to be, I'm not interested in what the operating model is going forward. Because to your point, and I'm sure you'll get to that as well, there's a case for doing things remotely, there's a case for things in person, there's a case for a mix, to my point. To be truly patient-centric, we have to offer a mix of solutions, depending on where you are in the world, depending on how ill you are, and where you are in your patient trial journey as well. So the platform needs to flex, needs to be able to work in those situations. It doesn't really matter where that patient is, where that site is, it needs to be the same consistent platform underlying it. So, well, I'm always going to go to this, I'm going to deliver this in these different manners as is so appropriate. So I think the evolution of digital trials is very much about answering that how question as opposed to the where question as well, because things are going back to normal, hopefully.
We hope so. We hope so.
Yeah.
Right. The focus for me is on the how and the little of what, not the what becomes just a byproduct of those first two decisions. And that's really why I dislike the direction we're taking with the word I don't want to use. I think digital, I think distributed, I think there's lots of things we can do, but you know what? It's a clinical trial. It's just a clinical trial.
Yeah.
Technology enabling patients to make a day by day, hour by hour decision on how they wish to participate in that trial. It's a good thing. I feel really good today. I'll do it from home. I feel really good, but I want to go in and have a chat to say I feel really good.
Yeah.
I feel really bad. You know what? I'm going to stay in bed all day, or I feel really bad. I need help. Those decisions should absolutely be free and something they can use. We shouldn't just be saying visit 4 has to be remote, visit 5 has to be in person.
Yeah.
Are there some things that have to be in person? Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Every study has an opportunity here to bring that freedom and that flexibility and that choice, which is why I really like that word used. If you have some advice for our data managers listening about adopting, digital solutions like a COA, ePro, e-consent.
Yeah.
Going back to our earlier point, the importance of working collaboratively and really thinking a total data experience. What advice would you give to our listeners?
Yeah, that's a good one, actually. I think it's another phrase, old phrase, I suppose, think about the end right at the beginning, sort of thing. So you're going to get this data, and it's going to be a tremendous asset. And at some point, it is going to end up in your CDMS, whether it's your statistical tables, your data warehouse, however you have that design within your organization. So you need to be involved at the design point, I would say, of the ePro to say, well, these are the data points we're collecting, and more importantly, this is the frequency. Because one of the biggest challenges of the data managers, because you like square corners, I would say, and obviously often when someone's recording how often they are feeling nauseous or migraine, it can't be driven by a visit schedule. So that's why it's never really fit in EDC from that perspective. Historically, we put it there because we didn't know where else to put it. But now we have other solutions that are much better at providing that full picture of both EDC data and all the external data that is coming in from all these different sources now. So I think from that perspective, and also think about integration. So it's always amazed me is how easy it is for a patient ID to be transcribed incorrectly. And whether that's from screening ID to randomized ID, whether it's from RTSM to EDC, EDC to ePro, or any other combination of those acronyms that we've just mentioned, if we can exchange that consistent identifier across those systems, you will save a lot of heartache for everybody involved within the system, everybody involved in the clinical trial process. So I would say that think about your data tables at the end of the successful clinical trial, right at the beginning of the design, and how ePro exists in your full data set, and how can we ensure, if it is a separate system, how do we get consistency in that metadata?
I want to put you in a position where we could hand you a magic wand. With that magic wand, are there two things you wish we could just stop? Resign to Room 101, never to have to do it ever again. And are there two things you wish we could just start doing? Just fix a problem. You can go as robust and as worldly and as holistic as you want, or you can pick two things or four things that really irritate you today. I'll give you total freedom of choice.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Great. A great question. I think starting with the things that we just want to happen. I think it would be great if we could, I know we mentioned this, I mentioned this earlier, we almost need a moratorium on the history of ePro, eCOA. And I mentioned at the beginning, some of the things we did have affected us later. I love the analogy you said, we shouldn't be worried about the history as we try and innovate the future. That's really weighing down our ePro, eCOA, because we came from everyone has to have a Palm Pilot. Yep. Because that's the only thing we had, just to be clear. No one really wanted to be shipping around tens of thousands of Palm Pilots around the world, which were dreadful to work with by and large. But that was the platform, and it functioned is how I describe it, but no more or no less. But it meant that everyone became obsessed, saying, well, we've always got to give the same device to every patient for every study going forward, and we always need to do that. So if they stop making Palm Pilot 5, you then need to validate for Palm Pilot 6 and so on and so forth. We just need to get away from that. And the easiest way to do it would just be sort of everyone just go, oh, yes, that's done. We're now moving forward. Technology is different. Our approach is different. The regulators understand it. That would be the one thing I would like there. And the other thing I think for me would be more in terms of patient recognition, more in terms of giving back to our patients. I think that, we all know clinical trial participation is still very low. It's, I think I saw some statistics this week. It's 5% of sort of US citizens have participated or are aware of clinical trials. And of that 5%, I think it's like 2 to 10% are from diverse backgrounds. It's tiny. And so I think that, we really need to work much harder on that. And I think we do that by the people we are working with today. Be more open, be more transparent, share the outcome of the studies, give them a summary at a very high level of what they submitted. What was the outcome of the result? Did the drug get published? Because you do that, it then means that the metric is they say, oh, I was in this study. It's quite cool. They still send me messages. We have the technology. There's an app for that, quite literally. Yep. And then who knows? Maybe they'll participate again. Maybe they'll tell a friend. All of those things would be good. And maybe they become part of a long-term follow-up study if they then prescribe the medicine. There's so much that would just be great to just switch on from that perspective. And in terms of Room 101, I'm just going to choose one, actually, because I know we are running out of time. And also, it's a big one. But it is ePro based, obviously. And I would say it's got to be provisioning, giving everybody a device. Whether they want one or not. I was part of that, I must admit, because that's all we could do. I ran businesses that had, at some points, probably a sort of 50,000 mobile phones in a warehouse as they were being moved around the country. But it needs to go. No one needs that. There's always some patients who will need some, and that's totally fine, and that's patient choice. But we don't need to force it to people who probably have a better device in their pocket anyway. So I would say, get rid of provisioning. It's expensive. No one likes it. Sites hate it, and patients are often disappointed. So that would be my one big one there.
Perfect. Well, on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much. But I'm just going to say, I think I'm going to highlight 4 things you've shared. First is I love the use of the word choice, because I think that is pivotal to absolutely everything we're doing. I like your phrase switch on. I think that's something we should all talk about. I think particularly switching on to some conversations about the past, switching on to what we can do now. I think there's another conversation for you and I to have about islands versus Rubik's Cubes, but we'll on that one at some point. And I would like to thank you for only using that word decentralized once throughout the whole presentation. So thank you very much for that. With that, I'm going to take a step back and perhaps leave you to have the final word with our audience before I return to wrap up.
That's great. No, thank you. I love the final one. But no, I really enjoyed the conversation as always. And yes, I think there's so much we can be doing. I get the fear that we are moving back to sort of a traditional clinical trial, which has some value, absolutely. But let's not lose the impetus around the technology, I think. And let's not forget that although there were lots of challenges in continuing business in COVID, it did happen. Stuff did get done. Vaccines got found and tested and launched, which is unbelievable when you think back now what they were dealing with as well. So to your point, let's take those learnings and really move them forward, and then hopefully we can really start to innovate in the industry.